Python. So you guys want to animate with Python? Well, let me show you how. Actually, I lie. You can't actually animate with Python. Don't be silly. I mean, you probably can, but it's not easy. But I do want to show you something that's kind of close to animating with Python. It's as close as I could get to an auto animate script. You know, we've got this little guy jumping. He's got no tail animation. What I can actually do is I can select this base tail control. I'm going to use this tool that I wrote called Noodle. This is entirely in Python, believe it or not. But what I can actually do is, you know, I can load the hierarchy of this control. I'm going to do a small little adjustment to the settings. And then let's create this overlapping setup. So what that's going to do is it's going to create a little setup for me that allows me, you know, it gives me some overlapping animation for free, basically. It allows me to adjust these controls. So, you know, it's a little bit floaty. So what I might do is increase some of the stiffness. And you can see now it looks pretty decent, you know, for an auto overlap script. Pretty good. I'm happy with that. I'm going to bake that back down. And now using this, we can begin our lesson. But yeah, I just wanted to show you guys that, to get you guys kind of excited about Python. We've got this little guy jumping here, okay? And we've got a problem. I've got this stage here. This little guy jumps basically right into the middle of the stage. So how do we fix that? Well, in animation, you can use an offset control. Not all rigs have offset controls. This one actually does, but let's pretend, okay? Let's pretend it's got no offset control. How do I do this? Well, we can create our own offset control inside of our scene. So I've wrote this script that does exactly that. I have my control selected, run the script, okay? And then what it's going to do is it's going to create a little setup inside of our scene, which basically allows us to do the offset control. So if I key that there, just before this little guy jumps, and when he lands, I'm going to key this up like that, okay? So it lands on the top. And I probably want to set these keys to linear, so everything's nice and sharp still. Okay, so let's close this out for a second. And now if I play this back, you can see it does the offset. Now he's not like floating anymore, and that's the important part. Okay, so that's what this little offset control thing does. And I'm just gonna Control Z back to the beginning. So this control still has the keys. So how do we do this manually? Before we do this in Python, let's try to break this down. How do we actually do this if we had to do it manually? Because knowing how to do things manually helps you automate. It really does. You know, you need to understand what you're doing first before you decide to sit down and write a script on how to do it. So let's break down how do we do this. Okay, so I've got this control, it's got the animation. So first thing I want to do is create a new locator, right? I'm going to duplicate it, and then I'm going to parent the duplicate to the original and then group it. Now we've got this little hierarchy thing, and that's what we're going to use. And we've got an issue here. At the moment, everything's at the origin, and I need everything to match this control. So what I need to do is snap this so that it's in the exact same position as that control. We can use a parent constraint to do that. So I'm going to select this control as the driver. I'm going to select this group as the driven group, what's being driven, and then come to parent constraint option box. Make sure maintain offset is not checked. Hit add, and that's going to snap this group to the position of that cog control. And then of course we want to delete this parent constraint now, because we're going to constrain this control back to this setup. And if we have that constraint there, there's going to be a cycle. There'll be a cycle error, and Maya does not like cycle errors. Okay, there'll be a cyclical connection. So next thing we need to do is cut the animation from this cog control and paste it onto this locator. Okay, we already have a script that does that, which we did the last lesson, the transfer animation function that we wrote, and I put it on this shelf here and I can use it straight away. So I'm going to grab this, locator, cut and paste, so it transfers the animation from this to this guy here now. And then last thing we want to do is constrain this guy back to that. So I'm going to grab this locator first, grab this control, parent constraint. Let's do a scale constraint as well, because we have some scale animation for squash and stretch. Okay, so there we have it. This guy is constrained. This guy has the keys. This one is what we can use to offset the animation. Okay, and we just have a group above that as a little buffer, you know, to set the pivot point so that it matches, so that our values of this locator is nice and zeroed out. Okay, so now we can use this. When we get up to here, just before he jumps, I'm going to set a key, frame 50, and when he lands, 62. Yep. So when he lands, I can animate him up in space like that, and set these to linear. And let's play this back and have a look. Okay, so that's doing exactly what we want it to do. So that's how you do it manually. There's a fair few steps, and you know, I think there's actually one more step if you want it to be super pedantic, is we really should be constraining this top group back into whatever is above that cog control. Because right now, if we move any of these world controls, it's not actually going to move like anything, because this entire setup is separate, is not being affected by any of these controls there. So what we want to do is grab the thing above the cog control and then grab this top group, and we can do a constraint. But we probably want to maintain offsets here, and then we can do a scale constraint, maintain offsets as well. So now if we move these top groups, you can see it's moving everything as well, because this setup is following these groups above, you know, these controls above it. That's basically it. And there's a lot of steps there, you know, a lot of steps to break down. And, you know, if in a production environment, you don't have time to think about like how to do all this and that and this and that, you know, you just want to hit a button and have it do everything for you. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to write the script that does this. So let's undo everything. So we have our animation back onto our control. Undo, 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 undo. And let's keep going. Okay, our control has the animation, so we don't need to go any further. Let's just delete that. Okay, and open up the script editor so we can begin. So we've already written this transfer animation function in the last lesson, and that's what we're going to use. I'm going to copy this. Let's just start a fresh tab. Okay, paste it down there. Okay, we're going to ignore this for now. We'll come back to it later. But we do need to run this first line, so we have access to the Maya commands. And I just want to go rapid fire through some of these Maya specific functions that we're going to use, just so you guys have a quick understanding of what they all do. Okay, so I'm just going to write them all down here. We have a function called space locator. And what does that do? You'll see in a second. All right. Then we have another one called duplicate. That one should be pretty obvious. And we have one called group to group things. We have another function called parent to parent things. And then we have our two constraint functions that we're going to use, parent constraint and scale constraint. Okay. And then just one last one, the delete. So these are all the functions that we're going to use in our scripts. Let's quickly go over each one. Space locator creates a locator, you know, just creates it at the origin. Okay, nothing crazy about that. We can give it a name. I'm going to give the name Bob like this. Run the script. You can see it's created Bob locator, and it's named it Bob because we've given it the name Bob. But when you run this function, you can see what its result is a list. So it returns a list. And inside the list is a string, the name Bob. And I can store this. So I can say A, store it in a variable called A. All right. But the problem is right now it's a list, and I don't want to store the list. I want to just store the name, the first item in this list. So I can access this list before I store it. Access the first item so that when we store it, we're just storing the name rather than storing the whole list. So if I run this again, let's delete Bob. Run this again, creates Bob. I'm going to print A, and you can see it's stored Bob inside this variable A, just Bob, not a list. Okay. If I don't do this, delete Bob, run this again, you can see it's just stored Bob, but it's stored the list, and that's not what we want. We just want Bob, not the list. Very similar to space locator duplicate. So if I run duplicate, what it does is duplicates the object that I have selected, and it also returns a list with whatever item that it duplicated. So it's Bob1 there. And you know, if we don't have anything selected, so if I delete Bob1, I don't have anything selected, duplicate's not going to work, it's going to error. We have to give it an object to duplicate. So here I can say either duplicate Bob like this, you know, typing the name itself, and it's going to look for the name. Or I can just use the variable. Because we stored the name inside this A variable, it's always nice to use variables. So I'm going to duplicate like this, okay? So now it duplicates Bob, and it calls it Bob1. What if we want to give it a name? Well, we can do that. Let's call it, instead of Bob1, let's call it John. And let's run this. You can see now it's duplicated Bob, but it's renamed it to John. And we can store whatever it returns. Because it's returning a list again, I don't want to store the list. I just want to store the name of the object. So we can access the first item in the list, and then we can store it in a variable. I'm going to call the variable B. Okay, so let's delete Bob and let's run these two. And you can see it's done it like that. Okay, so what does group do? Okay, so if I have two objects here, right, and I want to group one object, then what you can do is you can give the object name here like this. Okay, let's group John. So if I do this, it creates a new group and it groups John, just like that. Okay, if I want to group two items, I have to give it a list. So create a new list, and I can do Bob and John like this. And what it's going to do is going to create a group and group them both at the same time. So that's what group does. And of course we can use our variables, because we've created some variables, you know, A and B. I can use our variables there, and it groups whatever we have stored in our variables. And I can also give the group a name. So I can say name is equal to, let's just say my group like this. Run this group, and you know, it groups both, and it names the group my group, and then it gives us a result. And the result, the return value, my group, we can also store in a variable. And because it's not a list, it's just returning a string, we don't need to access the first item in the list. We can just store it straight away. Okay, and then let's move on. Let's delete that guy. The next one is parent. So if I create these two locators again, I can parent one thing to another. And if you remember in Maya, you always select the child first, and then you select the parent. So if I want John to be parented to Bob, then I need to put John first. So the child first, and then the parent. And then run this, and you can see it's parented John to Bob, just like that. And if I undo, come here and undo, and let's create those locators again. And I want to parent the other way around. Well, you can just switch it like this, you know, and it does the other way around. So that's what parent does. And, you know, parent constraint, very similar to how you do a normal constraint. The actual order you do it is kind of the opposite, right? So you want to get the driver first and then what's being driven. So if I want Bob to be the driver and John to be constrained to Bob, then I got to do Bob first and then John, like that. And if I run this code, you can see it's done the constraint just like that. And then here's the neat thing with these constraints, right? You can specify here if I want to maintain offsets or not. So I can say maintain offset is equal to true. So let's just hide the rig here for a second. And let's move Bob here, you know, without this maintain offset true. So if I remove that, if I run this code, you see it's just snapping John to there, okay? So if I want to maintain offset, so I don't want this to snap to there, I want to maintain offset, you can just add the maintain offset is equal to true there, and then run the code again. And now you can see that it's maintain offset. So Bob's still here, but John is constrained, and when I move it, it's all constrained up, but not snapped together. So this is parent constraint, and parent constraint, much the same, it returns a string, so we can store it. So I can store whatever it returns, and you can see inside there, it's actually the name of the constraint node, you know, so, but it's in a list form. So you can see it's still in this list form here. And I don't want it to be in a list form. I want to store just the name itself. So of course we can access the first item before we store it, so that it just stores the name of the constraint node. And then we can do something with it later, like we can delete it or something. But yeah, very similarly, scale constraint, I'm going to call this scon. Okay, and we can do a scale constraint as well. We can just copy these values if we wanted to. All the constraint functions use very similar, you know, parameters, very similar arguments. Okay, so we can run this. Let's just access the first item and store it. Run this, does a scale constraint, and then if we wanted to delete both these things, we can do delete constraint like that. You see it's deleted the parent constraint, and then I can do delete scon to delete the scale constraint. Or if I wanted to do it in one go, I can just give it a list like this, you know, and just call con and scon. Now run it, deletes both constraints. So we're going to go through and use all these functions in order to create our, you know, offset control group. Okay, so let's delete all that. Let's delete all this, and let's start running our function. Let's call this offset setup. I'm just going to put pass there to say I don't want to do anything in this function yet. I haven't quite figured it out yet. You know, I know I need a function that creates an offset setup, but I'm not quite sure, you know, what to put in there just yet. But we'll go through that, okay? So let's just execute our function. Select all our code, run it, nothing happens, you know. Should show our rig again, but if I run it, nothing happens because we're just executing this function and it's not really doing anything. It's just saying, hey, pass, don't do anything, you know. And even though we're running this code, you know, we're not actually executing the transfer animation, so it's not doing anything at all. Now let's do something. Let's create that locator, our first locator. So we do space locator to create our first locator, and then we want to store our locator in a variable. But if you remember space locator, it returns a list, and I don't want to store the list. I want to store the first index in the list, which is the name of the locator. Okay, and then in here, we should actually give the locator a nice name. But what name should we give it? I want to base all our names around this control that we have selected. Whichever control we have selected when we're creating this offset setup, I want to base the name off of that. So down here, I can store the selection. SL is equal to true. So this grabs our selection, if you remember. I want the first item we have selected, and I'm just storing it in this selection variable. Then I want to pass this into this function. But right now our function doesn't take any parameters, so I'll give it a parameter that it can take. And when I pass this selection, it'll add this selection into this variable obj. Okay, and we can use that. So we can use this to name our locator. So if you remember string formatting, I can format the string, and in that placeholder, I'm going to put obj, the name of our object, and then I'm going to give it a suffix of underscore locator. So run the script. You can see created this, and it's added underscore locator onto our control name. Okay, let's delete that, and then let's keep going. Next thing we want to do is create another locator. So if you remember, we created two locators and parented one to the other. So we can just duplicate whatever we've created, our locator just there. Let's give it a nice name as well. Same thing, underscore locator. This time I'm going to call it underscore locator offset. Format it so it has the name of the object, putting it there. And then we can store this entire thing in a variable as well. So let's call this locator offset. All right, and then making sure we get the index, the first index of the list, not the list itself. Okay, so we get the actual object name, not a list. So select that, run this code again, get two objects, and they're both stored in our variables now, but they're also nicely named. And then finally, we want to create a group. Okay, so I'm going to call this grp and then do cmds group em true, empty true. And what this does is it creates an empty group and it just stores it in this variable grp. But let's give the group a nice name as well. Let's call this underscore lock underscore grp. Let's format this string and let's give it the object name. And now group doesn't return a list, it just returns the actual name of the group. So we don't need to access the first item in the list because it's already a string. And then we can run this with this guy still selected. Okay, now it's created 3 objects and that's kind of resembling our setup now. Cool, so let's continue. Now, next thing we need to do is parent everything together. So I'm going to type parent setup. So just commenting our code to organize it a bit. And I should call this create object. Create objects and then parent setup to parent everything up. And I want to parent the locator to the offset and then the locator offset to the group. So we can do cms parent locator, the child, to the locator offset. And then I want to parent the locator offset to the group like that. Select this, run this code. You can see it's done exactly that. It's parented this to the locator offset to the group. Okay. And if you remember, the next thing we want to do is move this pivot point so it matches that exactly. And we can use our little parent constraint trick to do that. Okay. So down here, I want to match positions. And we can use a parent constraint, and I want the group to be snapped to this control. So if you remember, we're passing our control name into this obj parameter, so we can use that as the driver and our group as what's being driven. We want to make sure maintain offset is false, so we're not maintaining offset, so it snaps up to there. Okay, so we run this. Does it, this has got the constraint now, it's snapped to there. And of course we need to delete this constraint node so we don't get that cycle. So I'm going to delete that and let's make sure we store this constraint so we can delete it. And parent constraint, if you remember, returns a list. So we need to access that list to get the constraint node name, store it in constraint, and then we can delete that guy, you know. So select this control, run the script, does exactly that. It's all snapped up to the right position, but now, you know, it deleted the constraint and we're ready to copy animation from this to our bottom locator. And we can just use our transfer animation function that we wrote in the last lesson. So now it's all coming together, all the puzzle pieces. You know, we've done all that setup in the last lesson, and let's use that now to write a more complicated script. Okay, so how do we transfer? Well, we already have the name of the locator here. And the problem is, if it's inside of this function, if this variable is inside of this function, anything outside of this function, hence this code here, like anything we type down here, it doesn't have access to that locator. You know, it doesn't have access to this name. But we need the name to do our little transfer animation because we need to put our name here so we can transfer animation from one object to another. Well, to get access to this, what we can do is we can return the value. So we can return it outside of this function. Much like how when we run this parent constraint function, it returns a value and we can store it in a variable. So if we just return this locator and it returns the name of it, we can, when we run this script, which runs this script, at the very end, it returns a value and we can store that return value, you know, much the same. So I'm going to call this driver lock. So I'm storing the driver, this locator, I'm storing it under this variable called driver lock. And then we can use our transfer animation function. Let's just type that again, transfer animation. And then we want to transfer from our cog control, what we have selected. So our selection there to our driver locator. So let's run this code now. So select this let's delete that first, and then select this guy, run this, and you can see it's created the setup and it's transferred the animation from here to here. But you know, like by default, the transfer animation function just does a copy, you know, just does copy keys. But if you remember, we gave it an additional parameter here to specify whether we want it to copy or to cut keys. So in this instance, we actually want to say cut is equal to true. So we cut keys instead of copy. Okay, so I can delete this setup, select this guy, run it again, and now you can see it's cut the keys from there and it's pasted it onto this one. And then we can constrain this back to there. So let's undo, and we can start from fresh again. Last thing to do is to constrain everything back up. So we can do parent constraint. We can constrain our selection now, but we want the driver locator to be the parent, okay, because that has all the keys now. And we can copy this, paste it down here, and change parent constraint to scale constraint. So we get the nice scale constraint as well. So run all this code and it should do everything now. So now we should be pretty much done. It's got the locator snapped to there. It's got the keys there. It's constrained this control. We can use this little offset control to do our little offset animation. Okay, so I can animate this guy out. And there you have it. It's a script and it does all these steps procedurally using the code, and we don't have to worry about having to remember how to execute all these steps again manually. We can just run the script and it can do all the code, all the setup for us. Yeah, so hopefully you learn a thing or two about Python. Stick around.